right, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to our webinar series of the Unmanned Aerial Systems Cluster Initiative. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, our topic today is how to build a successful presentation to pitch your new technologies. And I'll begin by sharing with you a little bit about the Cluster Initiative before I introduce our speakers. My name is Amanda Radovic. I'm the program manager for the cluster, and we are part of an SBA Regional Innovation Cluster group. We're one of 7 clusters around the country. We focus on unmanned aerial systems, and our geographic footprint is Oklahoma and Kansas, but we also have national efforts. And today we're going to talk about the pitch for a very particular reason. We have our anchor event, the UAS Tech Forum, which is coming up in September 12th and 13th in Broken Arrow. And one of the features of the Tech Forum is pitch presentations. This is something that we've done in different variations for over a decade. And it is the most popular part of the event. Constantly get feedback on it from our attendees about how much they enjoy the pitch presentations and that they enjoy getting to learn about all the new emerging technologies that have UAS applications. So we are currently recruiting for pitch applicants. We've extended the deadline to May 18th. And if you want any more information about the cluster, you can go to uascluster.com. So that is our website, and it'll share information with you about the Tech Forum. It's a brief online application to put in your interest in participating in the pitch presentations. And we hope that you will check it out and that you will put in an application with your interest. It is technology focused. As long as your technology is past proof of concept, has any application in any UAS market, then we absolutely want to hear from you and learn more about your technology. So with that in mind, we want to really dive into the pitch presentation, the art of the pitch. And on today's call, we have 2 really fantastic guest speakers who are going to share all of their knowledge with us. And they come from different backgrounds. A lot of times we take this topic and we talk about it through the eyes of an investor. And on today's call, we have 2 entrepreneurs, one who is also an investor who wears many hats. So we're going to get a really unique perspective on what it takes to put together a pitch presentation, a successful pitch presentation, and all of the thought process that goes into it. So I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers, and then I'm going to let them talk a little bit more about themselves. Our first guest speaker is Elliot Brodsky. And Elliot is a true entrepreneur from start to finish. He started in TV as a TV producer and news broadcaster and part of different news channels, children's programming, and then also formed companies, had many successes, some shortfalls, all of the trials and tribulations that come with creating companies, and has done that for many years. And Elliot, you have a lot of really, I love what you put in your bio. You've started several successful companies. You've really gone through all of everything that an entrepreneur would go through. You've worked with Fortune 50 and 500 companies as customers over the years. So you've been a consultant for many of the most successful companies out there in the country. And you've been involved with early stage companies, and I love this, as an investor, an executive, a confidant, a consultant, and a mentor. And you have a great quote in here that says, there's always something new to learn, and there are always new opportunities. So I love that mindset. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about our next guest speaker, who is Dr. Kurt Rauser. Kurt, I really tried to highlight a few things that were worth mentioning in your bio, and I ended up highlighting almost your entire bio. So you've got a lot in here, so hopefully I can do it justice. You are an assistant professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering at Oklahoma State University. You have your BS in aeronautical engineering from the U.S. Air Force Academy, an MS in aviation science from OSU, and an MS in aeronautical engineering and PhD in mechanical engineering from the Air Force Institute of Technology. That is quite a lot. You were in the Air Force for 21 years, and you had numerous roles as aerospace propulsion intelligence analyst, operations officer for a jet engine test squadron, and then you also served as faculty, where you've received some very distinguished awards here, the most prestigious award, Teaching Award for Outstanding Academy Educator, and the Academy's highest research award for Faculty Research and Excellence. So I really appreciate you both being on the call today and sharing all of your knowledge. With that, Elliot, I'll turn to you. Tell us a little bit more, things that I left out, decades. So give us the highlights.
Well, thank you. And one of the things I almost hesitate to say, but what I started out with is that my very first company that I started, and I just want to say this up front, is that I started out, I didn't really have a plan. And what I did and it had to do with television production. And right away out of the gate, I had some very top clients. Among them were IBM and Singer Link and Endicott Johnson. So I had really great clients. But I didn't have a plan. And what happened is that, and I didn't really have any competition, but universities started graduating some young people who started giving me competition. And over and above getting competition, what began to happen is there was a recession. And as the recession came in, my reality is that I didn't know how to handle it. And eventually I had to fold up the company. And it was very humbling because I had hired people, I had a bank loan, I didn't go into bankruptcy, but I want to say I failed. I went out of business because I wasn't prepared for the eventualities of how that happened. Suffice to say, I recovered and I went on to start several other companies that became very, very successful, but I had a plan. And I'm going to talk today about, doing your pitch before you even get to the pitch is all about planning and research.
Great, thank you. And Kurt, tell us a little bit more about your your background, and you've got a technical background in unmanned aerial systems and some technologies that I barely touched on. So tell us a little bit more.
Sure, thank you. Actually, my background, it's interesting because it was all in the Air Force, and most of that really was with manned aircraft. It's only been recently in the last couple of years that I've had to sort of shift my way of thinking of simply just getting the job done, the mission accomplishment, to thinking about business, thinking about value proposition, and associating the work I do with ultimately meeting a customer's needs and being able to make it profitable. So my background, though highly technical, it was also very focused on jet engines. And that sort of frames the way I look at things. I tend to, how do they say, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So when I look at the challenges being faced by the unmanned aircraft industry, a lot of times I see jet engines as a solution. So I've also had to broaden my way of thinking to broaden my knowledge and consider other possible solutions. And in so doing, I've developed a lot of expertise beyond just jet engines. Ironically, some of my best information comes from my students themselves. While I may be able to impart some knowledge to them about jet engines, they often have knowledge about other disciplines and other technologies that I'm unaware of. And so I still remain a student and try to be open to learning. And last year's opportunity to do the 6-minute pitch was a great learning experience for me.
Yeah, so full disclosure, Kurt, you participated in our pitch session at last year's UAS Tech Forum. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and some of the outcomes that came from that experience. So I'm going to jump right in and, start with some of our first, probably the most basic question is that we are all very busy these days. There's lots of opportunities. And how do you determine when you're ready to pitch, when you're ready to disclose your technology, or when you're ready to go out there? What are some of the things that determine that level of readiness, and how do you decide what's worth your time? Where do you start, and which events or activities do you start with? So Kurt, since you kind of experienced this just a few years ago as you were starting to go out there and talk about your technology, what was the decision-making process like for you when you decided you wanted to go out there and really start sharing this with everybody?
Right. That's a great question. As an engineer, I think I have a lot of reservations about pitching the technology I'm researching, and I have a tendency to want to just keep researching it until I've figured out all of the answers to all of my questions about it. But I recognize that in reality, I've got to get something out there as soon as I possibly can for two reasons. One, so that I can understand where the shortcomings are in the technology. And the second part is so I can better understand how well it relates to the market need. And so once I saw the opportunity to give that 6-minute pitch, I looked at it as an opportunity for me to sort of test the waters a little bit, both in terms of how to give a pitch, but also into what the interest level was in the research I was doing. And so I would encourage folks to be brave, pluck up the courage, and as soon as you have something that is at least cohesive in terms of an idea, and there is some data behind it, or at least some sound theory behind it, to go ahead and take that first chance. And then after that, you'll probably switch directions a little here or there, pivot a little bit based on the feedback received, but it will help move things forward.
Thank you. So Elliot, what advice would you give to an entrepreneur if they come to you, and when would you say, all right, you're ready, or you should be going out and pitching your technology, and how that process of choosing the forum and the format?
I guess the question I have to think to myself is, I mean, there's lots of formats. And I think that before anybody starts to pitch, is they have to really understand how much research have they done. I've been to situations or pitches where people think they're prepared, they think they have this really wonderful idea, but ultimately, when we start asking questions of them about their idea, we recognize that as much as they want to get it out there, they're not particularly ready. And so, again, I go back to this idea is that how much research have they done about their idea and who the market is, who wants to buy, why they're going into business. Because, I mean, I'm not a VC, but as an angel investor, I really want to understand what their passion is and why they're going into business. And a lot of times, what reasons that people have to go into business is not always compatible with somebody who might want to make an investment. So I think there's some coaching that has to go on prior to that. If they feel at some point that they're ready to go out and make a pitch, then you have to go figure out who is the group that you're going to make that pitch to. And then you have to figure out how you're going to tailor your pitch. And so you need different pitches for different marketplaces or different people that you want to pitch to. And I think what happens is that it's prior to that, you've got to figure, you can try it and do it. But a lot of people might go out and make 300 pitches. You have to not get discouraged, but got to figure out who you're trying to sell your idea to.
It's true. I've never met an entrepreneur who had not had to pitch many, many times. And I've met entrepreneurs and worked with companies who had, just like you're saying, different formats. So they had a 2-minute, a 6-minute, a 15-minute. Some were more technical, some were more marketing focused. It was, they tailored them to the activity and the event that they were an audience, which I think is really important to do, is to always do your research, look at the audience, and try to tailor it.
Amanda, I'd like to say one more thing too about in terms of the format or the event to give the pitch to. There are times when I will pitch it to. I've had an opportunity to give a pitch to a group that was looking at where to put their funding. So it was clearly they were investors. That's very different than when I talk to someone that is the user of a technology, and I'm trying to explain why my technology has a better capability than another alternate technology. That's going to change the tenor of the presentation. And then finally, the vendors. If I'm going to give a pitch to somebody that might be the one to actually manufacture, produce, sell the technology in the form of a product, that also will change the way I present it. So definitely got to consider the audience.
Definitely. Yeah, that's good advice. So kind of starting from there, so you decided you're going to pitch, you're going to go out there and you're going to put yourself in the public eye, maybe for the first time. When you begin to put a pitch together, where do you start? Where do you begin? So Elliot, I'll ask you first, when you're coaching a company or working with someone, so you've decided, okay, they're ready. Where do you guide them to, let's just say they're looking at a blank PowerPoint. Where do you start?
Well, actually, I don't start with the PowerPoint. I ask them I want to know what their story is. Because the idea of making a pitch which is counterintuitive, the idea is not to really raise money. The idea of a pitch is to get an interest in your audience. You want that pitch to get everybody you're talking to, excited enough about your idea, technology, business, so that they'll ask you to come back for the second meeting. So the pitch is all about getting to the second meeting. And usually, and I like to keep my pitches, or the pitches I hear, I like to keep them short. Somebody comes to me, I ask them, can they tell me their idea in 30 seconds? They say that's the elevator pitch, but I would like to hear their elevator pitch in 30 seconds. I like to hear what their pitch is in 1 minute. And then they can expand upon that. If it's going to be slides, you can add to that. People need to keep things simple, and they have to get it across to me in a very simple way. A lot of times I say to them, can you tell me what your idea is in whatever amount of time, and pretend I'm a 10-year-old person and explain it to me simply. If they really can't do that, then they have to go back to the drawing board. But they have to tell a story, and I want to know what the story is. Once they got the story down, then we can talk about how to create a package around it.
Great advice. So Kurt, when you started this process, where did you begin?
Well, I'll tell you, the first time I probably didn't begin in the right place, but it still worked out for me. I would say the right place to begin is just like Elliot was saying, is that it's got to start with the customer perspective. It's got to start with who's going to be, if you're talking to end users, or if it's an investor who's got end users in mind. Ultimately, what is the problem that we're trying to solve, or what is the challenge we're trying to encounter? And it's best to know all of the details about that before going too far, because you can end up pitching an idea that is literally solving the wrong problem. So that means a lot of interaction. And I did some work through the NSF I-Corps that forced me to have to cold call, in some cases, different companies out there that were users of the technology or vendors, and to find out what their challenges were, what their perspective was. But ultimately, all of that information helps me to build the context to put the technology I have into the right perspective so that it can be clearly communicated. But I think it's also important to understand, and Elliot and I were talking about this before, to understand not only the customer's perspective, but the customer's customer. And there's you should be able to always go at least 2 levels now. And I think you can go further, but we both agreed that going down 2 levels was enough. So, for example, I might work with a company, I might be talking to a company that does aerial services using unmanned aircraft. But they are providing those aerial services to a customer, whether it be a pipeline inspection or assessing maybe a stockpile from a mining operation. And so I need to understand not only the aerial service director, what their needs are, but I need to understand what it is that they're trying to provide to their customer. So once I kind of have all of that story in mind, then it helps me to frame my pitch, which ultimately also starts with the context, the story, the scenario in which the solution, the technology is employed.
Absolutely. And Elliot, kind of going back to something that you said earlier, the why. Why is the technology important? We have a question that we're going to post here that asks, if you're listening and you're a company, why did you start your company? What was your intention? What were you hoping to gain from it? And you can just type it into the message box on the side, and later on I'll read some of the responses that we get. We're just interested in what is the end game, or when you're creating your company, what are your hopes and dreams, if you will. So we'll post that question up on a slide here, and if you can just respond, we'd love to hear some of your answers. So now we'll kind of get into, and this is what a lot of people ask, and it's a bit more of the technical part of the pitch. What do you have a winning pitch format that you suggest? So Ellie, you had mentioned, which I love, having different formats, different styles, different time frames. Is there a certain amount of time that you generally like to see? And when you sit down and you've done all the research and you've got the information and you're putting it together, what are the specifics that go into a winning format for you?
So a winning format for me is actually what you have to really think about. You really need what I call three pitches. You need a pitch, and I have to back up here. Most of these pitches are put together in some kind of, say, PowerPoint presentation or their slides. One of the things over the years that I object to, and even in pitches, is that what you never want to do is you never want to put your pitch out there and then read what you've done on your pitch to your audience, because those people, they can read. So you have to make a very simple, I would say maybe 10 slides. No more than 15, I would go with 10. And we could talk about that. But you have basically 10 slides. So there's two parts. So there is the pitch presentation. That's you expressing your passion about your company. And you need to practice that, and that timing of that as that meets with how you rehearse your slides. Personally, I think a winning thing is always, it's trite, but less is more. I like a lot of white space. Up front, two things. In the beginning slide is your title slide, your name, your address, the name of the business, and all of your contact information. You'd be surprised how many people forgot to put down how anybody can call you back and contact you. And I might want to say that maybe on your first slide you have your vision. Everybody today, I mean, I'm an old guy and all of that, but I don't use Twitter, but if Twitter's 140 characters and you can put your vision in 140 characters, you might want to put that in your first slide. The last thing is, besides what's in between, is the last slide, a lot of people forget, is they really have to, so the last slide is you have to ask for the money. And I'll come back to that, but you have to remember to ask for the money, how much money you want, and how you're going to use that money. So that's the first slide and the last slide. And in between, there's lots of formats about that, but essentially there's the problem. What is the problem that you see in the marketplace? So you see the problem, and then you have to figure out how you're going to solve that problem. It's very interesting in some things that are not always the same. In some technologies, it's always interesting if that problem that you see is also a problem that you have. Because if you see and that problem relates to you personally, then the presentation you make is that the investors or the people watching you, they can see that you identify with and you have some passion about that, and you're expressing that because that's a problem for you personally. That's not always the case. And then after that, you can go to, how you want to solve the problem, what's your unique selling proposition. And then, of course, what Kurt said, which I totally agree with, is that what you really don't want to do is, as I said, well, the marketplace is for this. The total area marketplace is, say, 1 million people or 10 million people. But, we know that we're only going to get 1/10 of 1% of that. Those kinds of statistics you don't want to put up there in this very simple presentation. Basically, what you want to be able to do is that you want to be able to give less is more. You want to get their interest. And I can go with you. I don't know if they want to do this now, Amanda, but I can go through what each individual slide might be. But you want to do that now, or how would you like?
And we can share some resources, because I do want to get into that, that question of what are some good research tools for someone who wants to look. So we don't have to get into the specifics of each slide, but I know there are a lot of tools available out there. I know we provide in our pitch presentations, we have a 6-minute pitch, 8 slides, and it goes minute by minute, exactly what each slide, 30 seconds on slide 1, 2, 3, and what information it should include. So I know we have a format, which we're happy to share after this call. And if you have a format or links or resources, we can share those as well.
That's not what I'm really saying, because as you're making this presentation, there's some slides up there, and it should kind of segue from one to the other. but I don't think there should be a lot of writing on a lot of these slides. These should be more what I would call a flow chart type of visualization, so people can get the flow of your story from your opening slide to your closing slide. It doesn't have to necessarily always be up there for a certain amount of time. If you want, for instance, a lot of times people, you can't make it to a presentation or something like that, or a contest, or to do your pitch. So a lot of people might say, would you send me your information? Send me your pitch deck. If you're going to send out a pitch deck, that's a whole different set of slides than the slides you have for the presentation you're going to make in front of people. And so you might want to think about a third kind of slide. And like Kurt said, is that you want to change these package of slides you have for different audiences that you want to reach.
All great advice. Yeah, absolutely true. So Kurt, where did you start? And you've done presentations that were to different audiences. What were some of the nuances or things that you found you had to change when you were presenting to investors versus presenting to maybe your peers or to a customer?
Well, let me start with what is essential, and then I'll talk about how I tailor it to the group. The first thing that is essential is to start with the context again. And I'm right in there with Elliot. If there is a takeaway, a certain takeaway, I'll put that in a couple words. But generally speaking, it's a picture. And when I approach my pitch, I see myself in two roles. I imagine myself as a storyteller and as a lawyer. As a storyteller, I want to connect a series of pictures that helps lead my audience from sort of a beginning to an end of the story. And the end of the story is, I agree, is the ask, the actual dollar amount. But in between, I'm kind of a lawyer as well. And that I'm trying to convince my audience beyond a shadow of a doubt that I am capable of delivering this, that the technology is within reach, that it's not some too far out of an idea. And so what then becomes essential is the need, identifying the need, identifying the value of the proposal, the value of the technology or the solution I'm proposing, and tied to that is profitability, I would say. In other words, so how much does it cost? How much do I have to put in before I can get something out? And how quickly do I get the return on that investment? And so, believe it or not, this is the part that was shocking to me. The technical parts of it are actually probably the least important. In fact, by leaving some of the technical content out, it tends to generate some interest, some inquiry. People want to understand, like, wait a minute, you're saying you're going to do this. How exactly are you going to do that? And so I do put some of that material in there, but when I tailor this to an audience, if it's investors, I'm probably going to spend a lot less time talking about the technical aspect. And if they're interested in that, they can pull that information from me in questions after the pitch. If it's vendors, then I will tend to focus a little bit more on the profitability part, which is to say that, how much do I have to put up? How quickly can I get a return on that investment? How am I going to roll this out into the market? And if it's a user, if it's closer to the end user of the technology, then I'll focus a little more on what the problem is and what features of the technology or the solution help best solve that problem. But in any case, I will always cover the need, the value, and ultimately what the profitability is.
So one of the questions that I want to ask is, and I probably get this question more than any other question when we're mentoring people and putting pitch decks together, the financial slide. So generally, they're early stage technologies. Obviously, UAS market is changing nearly every day, and new markets are emerging within the industry. What advice would you give about the financial snapshot? And would you include a financial slide? Is that necessary? That's the number one question I get. So I pose that to you to help us navigate that.
Let me jump in. I mean, the financial, in general, financial covers a lot of territory. The question really becomes is that most early stage companies have no idea. You definitely don't want to put a spreadsheet down. It's just too much information. Nobody can absorb that. If you make this thing exciting enough, the fact that you have a great opportunity to make money and get across the idea that there is money to be made, and like I said before, you don't really want to be focusing. I'll come back to the financial. You don't want to be focusing on this huge market or even the market of the market. You want to figure out, and what I actually ask young entrepreneurs or people is do they already have their first 10 customers? Do you know that if you actually go out, that somebody actually wants to pay for anything that you have? And in order to do that, they have to go, and Kurt mentioned it earlier, you have to go out and doing your research and doing your due diligence is to call somebody up and propose to them that I have this great idea. Are you willing to pay me for that? So that becomes a very focused part, a very, very small part in that small area of where you can make actual sales and have customers.
So Elliot, if you don't mind me jumping, Elliot, can I jump in 1 sec on that one? I would say I would go another step further and say if you can actually get a letter of support from them, that's even one step better.
I mean, so if you can do that, and all you have to do in your financial slide in your presentation is that you have to show that there is this opportunity in a very targeted audience that I want to approach, and I want to approach, or however you do that. We can approach this audience that wants to sell, who wants to buy my sensor, or my engine or my whatever I happen to have. They want to buy that, and we know that we can make that sales in that very, very small group. The people who are very smart investors can figure out, gosh, if they can get those people to buy that sensor, we're not dumb. There's a big, big market out there that they can go someplace else. And that's all you really want to do financially. You don't have to make any projections about anything otherwise financial. If you want to put together your financial spreadsheets, see if you can get yourself to the second meeting. When you get to the second meeting, they're going to ask you much tougher questions. And if you have a spreadsheet, show them the spreadsheet then. But don't show your big financial information out of the get-go. Over and above that, you don't necessarily know that there's an exit. They'll ask you about your financials. If somebody says to you who's an investor, so what's your exit strategy? That's, just pass. Don't even answer, because they shouldn't be asking you that question. You have no idea, and you can't really say at this juncture whether it's going to be an IPO or an acquisition or something like that. It's a question I believe never should be asked, and I always pass on it. I don't answer it. Does that help?
It does, yeah. Kurt, did you have anything to add to that?
I agree that it's a kind of a loaded question in the sense of when you say financials, are they asking for my financials, like how much financial backing I have? I don't know that that's necessary. I could talk about financials from the standpoint of, well, here's what the material cost and the labor would be associated with producing this technology or researching the technology. But I agree with Elliot that if I start laundry listing each of those things, first off, I've broken my first rule, which was I want like one takeaway from that slide, maybe two at most. And if I've got all these details in there, I'm not expecting somebody to actually mentally or even write down notes of all that. But the takeaway typically that they want to know is, do you have the capability financially and otherwise to be able to pull off what you're suggesting? And that's, I think, in that sense, I'd rather focus on talking about what team I've built around me. I've got legal support, that I've got support from small business developers or marketing folks, and don't want to give the impression that I'm doing it alone. The other thing in terms of financials that I would focus on would be, what is the size of the market? I think that's a valid question. It's also, it can be very misleading. Statistics can be, what do they say, 2/3 of all statistics are untrue. My point is that it is important for whoever you're talking to get a sense of the magnitude of the market you're going after, and the magnitude of the sales, the general idea of the sales that we're looking at targeting with this. And all that does is, again, puts things into perspective, puts things into context. But it has to be done in a very simple fashion because otherwise it will get lost. It won't be a takeaway. It'll get buried. Won't be able to see the forest through the trees, kind of a situation.
So Kurt, after making the presentation, because we talked a lot about on this call already about creating a story. So we've created this beautiful story. We've hopefully gone up and pitched it. We've gotten some interest. And you've had some really interesting follow-up from your pitch experiences that I wanted you to talk about a little bit. You were recently at Exponential, which is AUVSI's large annual event. And you've given, since we've started working together, I know you've given presentations to different groups, both Exponential, for example, and angel investors. What has been your experience? What were some of the questions, the follow-up questions that you had to be prepared for? And how did you leverage what you did into all these other opportunities?
Well, I will say there are basically two types of questions out there. There are some questions that are on the defensive. In other words, somebody's asking a question to me simply because they're trying to make a point, because they're on the defensive that my technologies might somehow disrupt their technology or their company. And so it's important to identify where the person's coming from in that regard. And the other type of question is one that is truly an inquiry, and where the person is curious about perhaps how the technology integrates into the market and what its limitations are. But oftentimes, if I've done my job right, the kind of questions I'm getting are, that's very curious. How exactly does that work? So that's usually a question I will get from somebody who's thinking from a technical standpoint. Someone coming from an investor standpoint might say, what are the limitations? What are the alternatives that a person might consider to what I'm proposing? And that way they can assess realistically if the technology I'm proposing has a real chance in the marketplace and how big of an impact it can make. But yeah, there are basically two kinds of questions I've gotten. I'll just give you one example from AUVSI. I was proposing a variable cycle engine that could be a turbojet or a turboprop, or could even be turbo electric. And I fielded a question from the audience about fuel cells. And clearly, since I had not brought that topic up, clearly I could identify that the person was coming from a perspective that fuel cells are a good way to solve a lot of these problems. So rather than go head to head with that individual or try to explain how that technology isn't as good as my technology, I'll usually admit that there is not usually one simple solution for all problems, but proposing the technology I'm proposing is the best approach to the particular context, the problem that I'm trying to solve.
Great. So Elliot, what advice would you give? I mean, the pitch is part of it, but then there's also the follow-up and the follow-on conversations.
Well, the follow-on conversation is that you finish the pitch, and what you're hoping for is an invite back. You'll say, we really enjoyed that. You're hoping that you're going to get a phone call. Would you come to lunch, or would you come meet our group again? And then they're going to ask you much more detail about whatever your pitch deck was. One of the things that is can you, a big question is a couple of things, two things. They'll ask you if it's a technical piece of it. I've been involved in a lot of stuff that's actually biological. They're going to ask you, and so for the biological parts, and I'm not a molecular biologist or a chemical engineer, I will bring with me to that second meeting the people who know the technology, and they can ask them technology questions. The other question is the marketing questions. Marketing and what that means to roll out or get your product out there, and the cost of getting a new client, and how you're going to execute, and can you execute. And to that extent is, as you put around you the team, they ask a lot, of the team of people who have the capability to execute your plan. They also want to figure out, have you really put together a board of directors that can help do this. There's also a lot of interest in who you might put together as your board of advisors, who can help mentor you through things that when you're a young entrepreneur or an entrepreneur with an idea, You're just so many things that you don't know about, you can't anticipate, and so you need help along the way. And what happens, you need to ask for that help. And then when they ask those questions, you're more prepared to answer whatever those questions might be. But invariably, those questions have to be with technology, marketing, and execution.
Good
Excellent.
answer.
So we've got some questions from the audience, and we've got a few minutes here to field some of these questions. So I want to make sure that we get to some of these. Some of them we've touched on, but we can go into a bit more detail. So one that I like here, and we talked about it at the beginning, was how do you determine which groups and events you approach or apply for to pitch? I mean, we're all getting pulled in so many directions. How do you decide which groups you want to go to? I mean, for example, Kurt, you've had some opportunities with investors, with more industry types of organizations. How did you decide which ones were worth your time?
Well, I knew that I needed to hit at least 3 different types. I saw that the tech forum, I saw that even though it's called tech forum, I was hoping that there would be some venture capital or angel investor in the audience. And I knew that by attending that, I was going to get the word out among investors. And I also recognized that that particular investor may say, I'm not interested in investing in this technology, but I know another investor who might be. And so I definitely wanted to hit one audience that had a good chance of having drawing investor interest. Then I pitched the technology again at a very highly technical setting at the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, highly technical. And there, my interest was to generate some discussion at a technical level, potentially draw in a collaborator that would help me grow my team and make the team more credible. And the third venue was at AUVSI, which I see as almost more like a trade show. And my intent was to spur some interest among the vendors, the companies that are in that industry who might see that technology and want to leverage it in their portfolio of products. And so in this case, because I was looking at propulsion for unmanned aircraft, I knew that I needed to go to conferences that really focused in on unmanned aircraft, on their uses, on their research and development of technology, and on, again, the trade show, on the actual vending, selling of that. So I know I needed 3 types, but I also needed to make sure that I was going to a venue where the focus was pretty clearly aligned with the technology I was pitching.
So Elliot, I'm going to completely change gears here and ask you a different question. If you're looking for licensing versus investment versus strategic partners, or if you're looking for a combination of those, how would you tailor your presentation, or would you make any changes depending on the type of partnership or funding that you are wanting?
In general, I would say no, because I go back to when you're starting out, what you want, you need to tell a story. I go back to this. It's very important that all of you out there understand your story. You make your story simple. You make it, you can make it entertaining, but you got to get your story down about what you want to sell. I go back again and say, if you had a great opportunity and you had Bill Gates in the elevator as you're going up to the top of the Empire State Building, what would you say to Bill Gates to get him to say, okay, when you get to the top of the elevator, call me up and I'll come out to Seattle and we'll have a conversation. I say that. So that doesn't really make any difference in my mind if it's licensing or strategic partners or whatever. You need to get somebody to say, boy, I think that's a great idea. I want to learn more. And so, like I said, you've got 3 different pitches. You have to hone your pitch. You got to make a very simple, basic presentation, and you got to get to that point. Once you get to that point, all the other things are interesting. Finding the right, so that gets you to the second level, or maybe to the third meeting. To me, licensing has a lot to do with having a good lawyer, or having the right legal counsel for a lot of what you have. I mean, Kurt has experience with this, but I also have experience, even though I don't own patents, but I work with a lot of people who have patents. I work with a lot of people who do technology transfer in licenses in universities around the United States. And what the university wants, the money's for, the license fee, what kind of royalty thing there, what does the professor get, what our students might want to get. So all of those things, when you go into those kinds of meetings, you need to understand what all the parameters of those happen to be. When you do strategic partnerships, the people who are they bringing something to the table that grows the business? I mean, one of the things about this, which we haven't talked about a little bit about strategic partners, and which I asked about the businesses, do you have a business that in 4 to 5 years is going to be grossing $20 million? If you don't have a business, I'm just suggesting to you, if you don't have a business that is scalable enough to get $20 million in 4 to 5 years, then maybe you have a very good idea for a business to make a couple of $1 million. And that's a whole different other set of dynamics about partners and investors. That's a big question you have to ask, because some businesses are $3 or $4 million businesses, but they're not $20 million businesses. So you need to figure that out up front so you understand who to go to for your meetings and who you want to do business with.
It's true. It's good advice. It's really good advice. So another question that we got from one of the audience members, and Kurt, you kind of touched on this. You said that after you made presentations, some of the follow-up questions you got were about the other technologies out there, or competing technologies. How do you address competition? Is that something that should be included in a pitch, or is that for a follow-on conversation, much like you've experienced? How did you handle that?
Sure. In the presentation, typically I'll include something like, here is the problem, here's how it is currently addressed. So I will address what the current alternatives are that are out there, and then I will explain what I'm proposing and how it is different, right? How it approaches it differently, perhaps, maybe how it approaches it more economically. But I have to be very careful that becomes a rabbit hole in the pitch. It's easy to get lost into the details about how the nuances of what I'm doing are different than what's already out there. But I think it's important, whether it's in the pitch or addressing a question afterward, to acknowledge the solutions that are out there. In fact, if there are places to really put some due diligence, some of that is in understanding the market, understanding the problem, but then I would also spend an equal amount understanding the current solutions that are out there, what their limitations are, and knowing that I'm not duplicating something, that I'm not putting something out there that is not unique. Because if I can't spell out how what I'm doing is unique, then the chances are very slim that I'll be successful. So it is important to acknowledge that they're out there. And by the way, I think whenever someone said, my technology is the only possible solution for this thing, right out of the gate, people are going to be thinking about, probably in the back of their mind, wait a minute, is that really a true statement? Because maybe I can come up with something that would be a better idea. So you sort of diffuse that by simply acknowledging that there are other solutions and they have their advantages, but that ultimately the proposal that I'm making is the best solution.
May I say something going back to partnership issues, which I think is very important for young entrepreneurs, is that I suggest that you have very good legal counsel in the process of raising funds, and that you have to be careful about who you partner with, especially if those people are giving you money, and what your term sheet is, and what is going to be your deal if you get to that point. And there are wonderful success stories about that relationship, and there are also stories which entrepreneurs basically get burned because they didn't allow for problems that essentially can happen. So I'm encouraging you all to get really good legal counsel as much as you can afford.
And that's good advice. That's one of the questions that I get a lot, because as you say, when you're going through this process of creating a pitch, you're thinking about all of these questions. You're thinking about the structure, you're thinking about their story, you're thinking about potential exits. And people often ask, well, what are they going to want? And how much equity should I give? What are they going to want? What should I put? And my advice, and you can tell me if bad advice, but is often unless you have something very specific in mind, to keep it pretty general, because each investor is going to have different requirements and they're all not going to be a fit for you, or partnerships or licensing. So some go in with a very clear-cut idea of exactly what they want, and that can be somewhat limiting, but you will eventually find your partner or your investor out there, whereas others, it's really going to be so dependent on the partner that you are working with, or if it's an investment, it's a VC. They are all so unique and so different in the way that they operate and what they want from the companies they invest in. So that's one of the questions that I get a lot. And Elliot, you kind of touched on that there's going to be term sheets and all of those things that come after that. That's a whole nother sort of activity that you're going to have to tackle when that comes around. And you probably will benefit from some legal advice. So those are things that down the road to think about. Well, we have a few more minutes. And so I just want to kind of end the webinar with one final question for you both. And whether an entrepreneur has pitched once or hundreds of times, what is the absolute one piece of advice that you would give them? If you were only allowed to tell them one thing, what would you tell them?
Honesty, simplicity, and passion.
I love it. Kurt, what would you give? What one piece of advice would you give?
Practice. Practice a lot. Practice with your peers. Practice with all kinds of people listening to you. To practice, and don't give up whenever when it doesn't go quite as well as you'd like. Just keep at it. Be persistent.
Both really great advice. Well, you both have offered so much to our listeners on the webinar and those who will watch this. Thank you really for sharing all of your knowledge today and being so candid and in what really is expected of someone who's going out there and making a pitch. And it's clear to see that there's a lot of thought and research that goes into it. And then just the technical parts of the actual slide and the presentation. But overall, from both of you, what I really feel like I heard today was that you have to have passion. I mean, you have to show people why it's important and why they should invest in you and your technology, and being able to demonstrate that is key. So I thank you both so much. We will have these webinars posted on YouTube. They will also be posted to the cluster website, which is uascluster.com. And as a reminder, I started the presentation talking about our pitch presentations that are coming up at the Tech Forum. Just a reminder, that deadline is May 18th. It's a brief online application. We encourage you to apply. There's some great benefits to participating if you're selected. You get to the benefit of working with mentors, and we provide formats and resources and information, and it's a great opportunity for those who have done hundreds of pitches to polish theirs or get out there to a new audience of potential partners, or for those who have never done it before. If you're putting together your first presentation, this is a great opportunity to get some help doing that. So Kurt, we wish you a ton of success. You've already gone on to do quite a lot since our paths have crossed. And Elliot, thank you so much. I mean, just a wealth of knowledge, decades of experience to share with the audience. They're pretty lucky.
Thank you
for the opportunity, Amanda.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you both.